Well, let me just thank the hosts of this conference, TakhtiBahi, for assembling such a wonderful group of people to speak to. I mean, I've been to many Gandharan conferences in my life, but this one is really unique, and I think has a breadth and a scope that's really refreshing and quite different and unusual. Also, I'm just delighted to be able to speak about TakhtiBahi. Probably the very first site I ever visited in Pakistan. I think I came here in 1989, 1990. And, you know, and fell in love with the topic of Gandharan architecture. So let's see what I can do. No, other way. Okay, so just I thought that Juhan Reed did a wonderful job of really kind of positioning us geographically, but it can never hurt to sort of think about the position of Gandhara here is sort of at the crossroads. I mean, leading through the Khyber Pass and up into Central Asia or through the Karakoram network. At the sort of the top of the Indus, and providing this sort of this gateway, I suppose, into all these complex trade networks across Central Asia and linking India to the rest of the world in many ways. When you look at the basin of ancient Gandhara, I mean this little kidney-shaped space here, it's bisected by rivers. It was agriculturally rich. And I think this is never really emphasized when we hear talk of Gandhara. It's always trade that's the source of wealth. But certainly this sort of rich agricultural place was key to the support of this huge monastic population that formed in the region. And I think politically it gave them control of these mountain passes. Oh, I keep going the wrong way. Here we are, zoomed in a little bit more. So the site of TakhtiBahi sits on this spur, this ridge that comes out, and it sits right here. This whole spur is where we see a whole group of Buddhist sites. And of course, here's the Swat Valley, with Kara one sitting up here. Again, as Juhan Reed was mentioning, there's this constellation of sites in this ancient path that connects these two areas. And then, of course, Taxila sits down here, separated by the Indus, you know, the other, you know, key center that we really can't even begin to think about, this area of proper Gandhara. And I think it is important to think when we're talking about proper Gandhara about the sculpture that stone sculpture, the schist, this core group, being this you know, relatively small area. I mean, you can walk from here to here in a few hours. It's not a big place, and yet so many sites were built in this tiny area. Oh, there you go. You can see the ridge system. And so when I'm standing here looking at the site, that is the ridge system that I'm looking back along. And here is the sacred area. One of the reasons that I'm speaking without reading a paper is I'm trying to, in this talk, to show really a lot of slides and try to really give you a sense three-dimensionally of the site, which I think is always difficult to do with architecture. I'm standing up on a ridge in amongst all of these monasteries here, looking down into the sacred area. But, I mean, it's an extensive complex. You have three sort of adjacent ridge systems full of monasteries. And then the main sacred area, which I'll spend almost all of my time talking about, sits out on this large sort of spur, but surrounded by just, you know, hundreds of, well, small structures. And, you know, the monastic population at the site must have been in the hundreds at least at its peak. Before I talk about TakhtiBahi, I actually have to jump to Taxila. And I apologize to sort of start with one and switch to the other, but Taxila allows me to go back a little bit in time. TakhtiBahi is not the earliest site. It's part of the sort of the main phase, I think, of Gandharan architecture. At Taxila, here is the Dharmarajika Stupa, and the surrounding monastic areas and sacred structures. We have an earlier structure. It's hard to know when this was actually founded. There's always this desire to say there's a Shokin foundations for some of these sites, and there is an Ashokan edict at Shalasgari. But I think that it's fair to say that in the first, perhaps 2nd century BC, sites like the Dharmarajaka certainly had stupas in them, were starting to be active, and we will hear from, I think, Jason Nealis later on about some of the text finds, and we were just talking about reliquaries, and a lot of material from the right around 0. So many of these sites are getting founded in this early phase. The other reason to open and to at least mention Taxila is because of the masonry. Taxila is a big complex. I mean, here is, let's see here, here's the Dharmarajaka, but you'll notice all these small dots are secondary monastic centers, and they all are sort of sitting adjacent to Sirkap, a city, but I mean, you just get a sense of the wealth of material. And this was excavated by John Marshall in the teens, 1910, 12, but going through, he publishes his report in the 50s. But the key issue there is he was able to identify masonry types that are distinctive only to this area. Essentially, there were large limestone blocks that were set then with little chips of stone, and you go from a very disordered rubble masonry that Sirkap was built with a lot of that type of masonry. Then there was probably an earthquake. They realized that it was an unstable building system. That by organizing the rocks into sort of regular courses, they could build bigger buildings, they could build thinner walls. It was just more efficient. And then by adding in layers of cut limestone and laying the blocks on in sort of systematic way, you can build higher walls. I mean, and it becomes more stable. The structures that are associated with these 4 different masonry types can be associated with numismatic evidence, and it gives us phases, right? So in other words, when we go back and look at a site like the Dharmarajaka, you can say, well, this is an early stupa because it's one type of masonry. This was built slightly later, and so on. And so in the area of Taxila, you can set up a chronology of structural types. And we all, I think, start from this as all the architectural history, and I think of so many foreign and local excavations that have taken place following this sort of early British period, the Japanese, the Italians, lots of Pakistani archaeology. They all, start from this sort of basis, this body of material in Taxila. Unfortunately, when you get to Gandhara proper, you cross the Indus, there aren't any of these nice limestone blocks laying around. And so the masonry kind of varies from being, a variant of the rubble masonry, or perhaps more organized and looking something like this diaper masonry, where you have an irregular block of schist, but then set with these small chips. But it doesn't give you anything that you can chronologically order. It's very frustrating. And we have most of the architecture of Gandhara proper is different from what we see in Taxila. And so all of this sculpture that we have is associated with a body of architecture that, that Taxila doesn't really explain exactly. So, I mean, there's sort of this bridge. And that book that you mentioned, Kavita, at the beginning of my dissertation, in many ways looked to kind of form these bridges and to do sort of comparative study across the 2 regions and link things back. So that gets me back to TakhtiBahi, which has this more regular masonry. But fortunately, it's because it sat out on this spur, their space was at a premium. And the monuments are very tightly packed together. In other words, one was built adjacent to another on top of the foundation of the third, and you can actually systematically go through the sacred area, and even without doing any kind of comparative analysis to Taxila, say, well, this shrine is later than that shrine because it's built on top of its foundation, right? And so just through direct observation, I was able to sort a lot of the monuments at the site into some sort of coherent pattern. So when did the site begin? this is a question and a problem. This inscription by Gandhara is at the root of that question. I mean, people will, it was found very early on, unfortunately very, very early on, and there's even a debate as to whether it came from TakhtiBahi. So, then, how to date Gandharas, and is it a follower of Gandharas? I mean, is it someone calling themselves Gandharas? I mean, the very issue of the name Gandharas in this inscription and its date, again, becomes problematic. But I think it's fair to say, that the site was probably founded, like so many others in Gandhara, in the 1st century AD. That inscription and the material that we find at the site fall into, I think, a pretty regular pattern. In other words, it is not from the period of Ashoka. It is in the flourishing sort of main phase of Gandhara, when this center was first built. A phase where perhaps we have images like, and I show you the stair riser that's actually in the Metropolitan's museums, from Bunir, more than likely. And we have these Corinthian pillars and this row of, I mean, we call them river gods. It's hard to know. They have little canvas skirts. They hold paddles. Are they paddles? I'm not sure. They certainly have great attitude. And you know, and I love that the anatomy that's not really quite right? But you know, certainly referencing that classical tradition that you know that we associate with the earliest phases of Gandharan production, largely because of the Afghan material, the recovery of Iconium, Alexander the Great, and so on. So when we look at this very early horizon, we look at objects like this that really don't have any specific Buddhist reference. I mean, it is an image of gods that are probably protectors, associated probably with the steps of a stupa. I mean, so one can sort of see them as protectors and understand them readily that way. And I mean, their classical form, I think, is interesting. This is sort of where we begin in that sort of chronological sequence. And a large group of these were found. Can you show several of them? The only other thing I can show you from this really early horizon that's Buddhist are these garland holders. And again, this is in the Metropolitan's collection, but I wanted to bring in this stupa that is from Swat, from the area of the Malakan Pass. This is the Chappat stupa, and you can just see these little garland holders popping up the side. I just love these early photos. So this photo was taken by Alexander Caddy in 1896. And you can see the garland holders. There are no other in situ garland holders. There's only this picture. But it really does give you a sense that maybe a garland was strung around the body of the stupa. And that we have this little goddess with her wings, and she holds flowers, and you know she's bringing offerings to the stupa, and an early style. Personally, I find with the issues of chronology and dating in Gandhara, this kind of evidence to be incredibly helpful because we actually can stand in a place and say, well, this is an early style. The stair riser, even, we're less sure, but here you can really say. Unfortunately, this was in the way of a road. Soon after this picture was taken, they built a road right across that stupa, so that's it. We have this picture. There's one other. That's it. But get back to TakhtiBahi and to really focus in. I want to look at the foundation of the site. This small stupa right here and this little cluster of small stupas around it. So this P1 stupa and these blue stupas are the earliest structures that we have from the site. It's interesting when we look at them, and I'm going to now show you some pictures. This area of the site is a fair wreck, so it's sort of difficult here. I'll give you an idea. There it is. This is a photo from, who is this? This was Hargreaves who took this photo. And here you can see the stupa right here. That's the P1 stupa. Here's the stairway leading up to it, right? So let me just go back so we can look again. So there's the stairway leading up. I think that picture is taken sort of at an angle like this, looking into the court. It's an interesting picture because you can see this plethora of images sort of laying about the sacred area. And when we look at the small stupas, some of them seem to have been refurbished in a later period, but some of them probably had their original decoration. These small stupas, now, let me just, very little can be said about the P1 stupa itself. It certainly probably has a decoration and embellishment that relates to the end of the site. But some of the small stupas undoubtedly looked like this when they were first built. So this is a style of stupa construction that probably, okay, is 1st century going into the 2nd century, so the earliest period. You can see it has a square base, and then sort of a step drum. There's this ring, and then various bands of decoration. Note the Vedic fence. I always found it very interesting that you think of Sanchi with its fence around the main stupa has been conflated onto the drum of this stupa. And in fact, I think one can think of these Gandharan stupas as the round piece of the stupa as the sacred part of it. It sits on a base. The base acts as, in a sense, the Vedika, how to put it. When you find stupas being deposited, relics being deposited there at this level, they're never into the base. And so, you know, they're elevated into the drum of the stupa. Equally, this is where we find narrative sculpture appearing. Now, let's go back. So the narrative, if this is the Vedika, then we have a sort of a garland running around the upper part. This blank zone is where I'm going to argue the narrative was placed. And basically we know that because of this Vedika pattern that repeats over and over in a lot of the loose fragments that have narrative in them. So in other words, here we have little putti or little figures sitting under arches with grapes hanging at the corners. They run along the top, then we have this nice Vedika fence. And then down below, of course, you're circumambulating, so you're reading this direction. It's the birth and the first bath, right? This relief, unfortunately, is not from TakhtiBahi. I'm kind of drawing in a few images from other sites. This is from Sikri, but it's part of a group of 6 panels, and I just thought it was sort of nice to be able to show you a complete sequence that would have wrapped around one of these small stupas. So here's the second relief. Here we find this, it's a tug of war. These are athletic competitions that Siddhartha undertook in order to prove that he was worthy to marry. He, of course, wins. But we see this childhood scenes. So these are running around the space now. So here's sort of a drawing. It's not so different from the piece from the British Museum I showed you, but in other words, you have your decorative panels, you have the narrative, the Vedika, and the little Amorini. Then you have this central false gable. The false gables are an interesting topic because, of course, they, and Jiahong, I very much appreciated what you were saying about the Buddhas being placed in rows, and you know, what is the image that is venerated. But I think on the small stupas, we can be fairly certain that the false gables, just because of their position and relative scale compared to this kind of narrative, must have been venerated. And in fact, if we look at the content, this, by the way, is from TakhtiBahi. The content that sort of sits within these, here we have presumably the Enlightenment, it's broken, the Buddha's first sermon, you can tell because of the wheel right here in the beer, he's submitted by the original 5 disciples. And then several scenes of conversion, perhaps measuring the Buddha, and then his death. So we kind of run down the major post-Enlightenment scenes in a sort of a group. And then we have lots of figures on either side venerating this central group. I mean, so it seems very, very much, though in a narrative moment, and I would argue in a period that predates the advent of large iconic images of the Buddha. This is difficult to know for a fact, but if you look at these narrative images, they typically have large Buddhas, they're surrounded by smaller figures, and there's iconography indicating the narrative moment, a lot of which is stripped away by the time we get to the large Buddhas, which sort of stand as single, sort of essentialized figures. And I think that this one leads to the other. How to date these, I have no idea. I'm going to sort of say they're 2nd century. The narrative doesn't have any complex mudras. In other words, we don't find the Dharmachakra mudra within the narrative. or the Bhumish Parshamudra, where he touches the earth at the moment of his enlightenment. All of that is missing from this sort of corpus of material, so it does suggest a relatively early date as compared to other imagery. To go back to my Sikri group, wrapping the rest of the way around, here's an act of conversion and then the death. Now, one of the really interesting things about this Sikri sequence is that you then have a whole group of panels that follow his cremation, and then here's the division of the relics into the 8 original stupas that Ashoka eventually opens, right, and distributes to 84,000 parts. The transport of the relics and their enshrinement. And I think this is because, and I've argued this elsewhere, that we're really seeing where did the Buddha's body come from, right? I mean, it's the relic of the Buddha that's presumably in this structure, or in the center of a main stupa, certainly, in Gandhara. And many inscriptions mention the presence of Shakyamuni's relics. And when he dies, he leaves relics, right? And so this whole narrative really is talking about his birth. And then, you know, the last 3 panels are devoted to his death and leaving his body in our realm of existence. So I think that's quite significant. And I think it speaks to the organization and emphasis that we will see in the Gandharan architecture. I don't want to suggest that there weren't narratives at TakhtiBahi. They just don't lend themselves to a nice narrative as easily. Both of these are there, and here we have probably the gift of grass and the Buddha approaching the Bodhi tree, and probably various scenes of conversion following his enlightenment. And I think it's interesting also if you start to look at the pillars, these probably were on a single stupa. At TakhtiBahi, Spooner especially recovers 472 sculptures. We know that Wiltshire in 1871 finds another 130, and these are just the numbers we have. And in preparing for this talk and doing research on the site for the last 20 years, I've found many of these images in microfiche and in other formats. Unfortunately, I don't have that much of that material to show to you, but much of it is sitting in the British Library. And I think it would be a very interesting project to reconstruct this huge corpus of material associated with the site. Here's a drum that's nearly complete, wrapping around students. Okay. So then this brings us to the issue of the standing icons. This kind of material was found in a sense in great abundance at TakhtiBahi. I mean, I think this site, being that it was found by Bellows in 1862, and then excavated initially in 1871, but then with Mardan being adjacent to the site, so many of these sort of military people who were stationed in Mardan went to TakhtiBahi and were collecting sculpture. So it's the sort of the sorry, Bilal also probably, but I think TakhtiBahi was very obvious. And a lot of the sculpture that initially made people aware of Gandhara came from TakhtiBahi. So when we look back then at the site, it's kind of interesting. So we have this early foundation, right, with the narrative. Probably, by the way, I should say there was a monastery here. If you look behind this monastery, there you can see foundations. So there was a big structure here that predates this. So this courtyard and a monastery was the earliest sort of manifestation of the site. The next thing that gets built is this court and this monastery, and we know that because all of these small image shrines lean up against them. They share this wall, and it's very clear when you're at the site that these predate. It's interesting that probably a single patron built them. I mean, they're very organized. They're opposite one another. There's this corridor that runs between them. All of these shrines, this is a very unusual court, were built as a single unit. They're all exactly the same size. They were built by a single patron. However, when we look down in this courtyard and the most sacred area surrounding the P1 stupa, These are all built heterogeneously. In other words, they are individual donations. There was no sort of system. I'm sure that you know, it was very advantageous to build this particular shrine because it's right on the P1 Stupa, and I imagine the patron who was able to donate that, you know, probably made donations to the monastery. This one wonders, but there seems to be a hierarchy of placement that one sees, and the sort of accumulation of small shrines. I want to begin by focusing on this little group right here that are at the base of the stairs, and here we see them. These early shrines, and some of the earliest shrines to be added to the sacred area are tiny. They're less than 1 meter tall. And if you go systematically across other sites, Jamagari, Traili, Nekasanda, Taxila, you find this pattern of the earliest shrines that one can sort of find in the sacred area being rather small. So here I just show you these, and here when I say that they're heterogeneously added, you can even see it in this picture. You see how this base comes up here, and you know this shrine sits, and you can see how this base was built up against that base, and so on. And you know, one wall is piled against the next. And what we observe is the small shrines leading to larger shrines, which then have bigger shrines built against them, which then have monumental shrines. You know, and so there's this sort of progression towards bigger and bigger imagery. And again, this is something that's repeated across the sites. It seems really sort of an obvious thing to say, but you go from little itty bitty imagery to bigger and bigger imagery. Not to say that in the late period you couldn't have little images. I would want to suggest that, you know, in the 4th and 5th century people weren't commissioning small images. But I think in the early period they certainly were not commissioning big images. Because we don't have any shrines to house them in. It's simple as that. I mean, we have little shrines. So that's sort of helpful. And it does sort of play out again with lots of architectural evidence. It's a difficult argument to make, but if you start to look at the coin evidence associated with the sites, you can really sort of suggest a chronological sort of shift. I mean, in other words, you can roughly date the early, the middle, the late phase of any one of these sites numismatically. Right? And so, looking at, again, my plan, so we have these little itty-bitty shrines here, and then we have, you know, somewhat bigger ones along this wall. I mean, I would not dare to suggest that I could date the difference in date between this shrine and that shrine, but it does seem that, you know, you move towards later shrines. These really big shrines, and I think M1 right here is 37 feet 9 meters tall on the interior wall. These really big shrines are definitely later and must have displaced smaller shrines. I mean, given that we have this whole row of shrines here, it's hard for me to imagine that there wasn't anything here. I just think that someone built big shrines on top of the little shrines and got rid of them, right? Or right here, right next to the P1 Stupa, these two massive image shrines, clearly displaced. So there's a constant, I think, renewal of the sites as well. I want to focus then on this upper court, which I argued was built actually before all these small shrines. So here are the shrines we've been looking at. Right? Here's this road that's up against the monastery, where it's more or less the same angle. So here is this P2, and we're looking at this group right here, running right along this front wall. I want to look at this court. So here's the earliest photograph that we have of the site. This was taken in 1891, and it's a picnic. See all these guys with their pith helmets? I think someone's going to speak about colonialism in Gandhara. I like the ladies with their umbrellas, and they're standing on top of the rubble of the stupa. Right here here's the surrounding court. You can see the monastery here in the background. First, I find these early photographs to be incredibly helpful because so much unrestored material is preserved. I mean, look at this wonderful shrine and its dome that's so intact here on the side. And we know that in 1871, so 10 or 15 years before this picture was taken, Wiltshire, an army sergeant, came to the site and excavated this upper court and found 130 sculptures. He describes them as 46 heads, 35 squatting human figures, 75 erect figures, and 7 frescoes. He doesn't even, I think it's really interesting the naivete even of it. He doesn't even really know what he's finding, right? He's recovering these sculptures. Who knows what happened to them? A woman named Elizabeth Arrington has written a very interesting book or dissertation tracking a lot of this, and she was the one to discover this report of Wiltshire, which was filed with British military records, right? Because he spent money, and therefore had to account for that money being spent, and hence describes the excavation of this court. This picture actually is slightly later. You can see the court has now been cleared. This is 1905. Fouché took this photo, or had this photo taken. The monastery is still here in the background. You can see these very tall walls, all of which have fallen today. My guess is this is a fiction, right? Because if we go back to our picnic, we don't have a big tall base stupa here, so someone built it in this picture. You always have to be really careful what you're looking at in these photographs. People are constantly refreshing the site, how to speak. But here we have 15 shrines. And here's my little brother sitting in one of the shrines. And you really can actually get a nice idea of how they're built. They have sort of a simple sort of niche, and then there are these corner panels set in, and then using sort of trabeated rocks, sort of one leafing out from the other, you get these small interior domes. And here, looking up in it, you can sort of see how this works. Right, so here looking at the back, and here you can see the tops of some of these domes. So this is the looking at the back side of that court. Let me just sort of give you, yes, right? So I'm standing here looking at the backs of all of these shrines. Now, if Wiltshire pulls out 130 sculptures, where were they? There are only 15 shrines. And now we can argue for reuse, but I think it's very interesting that you have far more images than you have image shrines. Presumably initially when they were built, and especially given that they're a group of 15 that are so regular, I would think that there were images placed in them as a group, 15 images. But then people continue to make donations into the space. And it does bring up the idea of these objects being votive. I mean, that maybe you generated merit by donating the image, and that sticking them into a sacred area, was a way to ensure a proper rebirth, or maybe for your parents. And so these courts then filled with imagery. And this must have been tied to the patronage of the monastery. An idea that I want to sort of tease out as we go along. So here's this upper court. And here's with the picnic again. This is the other picnic photo. They took 3 photos of this picnic. But here you can see the back of these image shrines. And I just love the contrast between this photo and this photo, right? Look, this shrine right here is this building right here. So this whole area has a sacred area underneath that they just were unaware of during their picnic. But we have a wonderful sense of the form of these shrines, which must imitate the roofs of, I would think, wooden structures. And people have made this kind of an argument, certainly across India, that this stone is then imitating wood and other materials. Nice picture too of all the structures going up the back of the hill. Right. So, now to go back into the central courtyard and to think a little bit about this monumentality and what's happening with that and how that works into the site. If you look into this courtyard, well, for one thing, we suddenly have the ability to see all of these these images laying about the court. And if you zoom in, here you can see a few. There's one laying there. The stupa clearly has been embellished in stucco, which I think is a late phase of the site. But these big icons would seem to then date, well, following Juhung's dating at least to the 3rd century, and this is what I've always thought. And as we go forward in the site's chronology, the 4th, presumably the 5th, right? The Hunas come in 450 AD and destroy the site. So one of the big questions in my mind when you look at an image like this, is it really all Kushan patronage? Is it all 2nd century, 3rd century? Or are we really looking at a 4th or 5th century image? And I think this is a big issue. And one can, I think, glean a lot from the sacred areas and thinking about how that works. The other thing I would bring up, though, in looking at this picture, is assuming that we do have the Sasanians invade, we have the Kittites coming through, we have the Hunas coming through, and so on and so on. And there's this constant disruption politically in the region, and ultimately probably a collapse in Gandharan patronage. Are we really looking at a distribution? I mean, the fact that they found these images more or less in this area, are we looking at original placement, or are we looking at reuse? And I think we probably are looking at a disturbed site, right? That the site was over and over, pieces were moved around, and after each disruption, and then it's also a region which has earthquakes. There was just an earthquake there, and I read that a large wall, and I'm worried that it's one of the big image shrines, collapsed at TakhtiBahi. But there's this constant sort of moving and recontextualization happening. So, these images. And I brought in a few that I know from TakhtiBahi, that I'm certain. Here's the false gable that I showed you earlier, but here we have these two very nice images. And when we start to think of workshop production, and you look at this kind of a Buddha with his sort of engaged leg, and being able to really see the body underneath, and the hairstyle, these things that we were just talking about, it becomes very apparent that you have a workshop style that is happening at the region that is not easy to interpret, because you have a chronology that you don't understand, right? In other words, is this an early image, is it a late image? And perhaps we can, through style, work that out. But when we go to a site like TakhtiBahi, we find the importation of images. So we get lots of different stylistic groups being brought by patrons. I think patrons, Gandhara is small. You go to this guild or that guild, and you buy an image, and and they look different, right? You pay for different quality. I think these are both quite lovely, but I mean, it's not that all the material from TakhtiBahi is alike, because probably they came out of different workshops. But then, to complicate the matter, they also probably came into the site's sort of corpus over a period of 200 or 300 years, so that you have a lot of issues sort of going there simultaneously. Get a lot of Buddhas and a tremendous number of Bodhisattvas. These are our two categories. The Bodhisattvas are nearly as numerous as the Buddhas, and the most numerous, of course, is Maitreya, or anyways, a flask-holding Bodhisattva, though we do get other iconographies. I just grabbed a few other images just to give you a taste for what was found. I mean, I think that the quality at TakhtiBahi is really exceptional. I typically sort of see Jamulgari and TakhtiBahi as having the most beautiful imagery. Maybe Jamulgari is even more beautiful. Some lovely pieces at the Indian Museum in Calcutta from Jamulgari, but a quite refined image. So these we know came from the site, right? And here I show you this sort of very distinct hairstyle with these snail shell curls. A drapery pattern that is associated, I think, with late imagery, a more Gupta face, something that is related, perhaps, to Kashmir, perhaps to, it's a late phase in the Gandharan tradition. But then we get things like this huge monumental Buddha, which kind of has that similar hairstyle. I love this fabulous image from Lahore. This is my brother again. He's 6'3". He's a tall guy. He's a big Buddha. But then we're left with really wondering if it is from TakhtiBahi. And I just bring this up with so much of this imagery because it's such an early site. I mean, this is called TakhtiBahi, but just because the British collected it and said it was TakhtiBahi, did it come from one of these other sites? I mean, they weren't maybe as careful as they were, especially if it was a military acquisition. It's being a very early object. But certainly those big images like this must have gone into big shrines. And so we can actually do something of a stylistic analysis because that image is quite different from that, right? I mean, they really are distinctly stylistically different. Forget the scale, just the way the hair is done, the way the facial features are, the way the treatment of the body. That is much more formal. It's more, hierarchic in its presentation. It's a different way of rendering the hairstyle. I would argue that the presentation of the body is quite distinct. And so we can sort of, to some extent, say probably that one is early and one is late, though I would be very cautious. And we have these big shrines, right? Now, the really big shrines like this one didn't contain schist imagery at all. In fact, once you get to about 12 feet or 3 meters, the schist starts to fall apart. You build these really big images and they disintegrate. I mean, it's almost impossible to find a piece of schist that's at 3 meters. It's a handful of objects that fit into that category. But with stucco, you can go to really big. I mean, that was a big Buddha. And, we don't even have the top of the shrine. This is broken off. So, I mean, at least 37 feet tall. And here you can see it, again, in a very early photo. So it's this shrine. So you can sort of see this edge right here is that edge right there. Now, I brought this picture in, and I think all the detail. Yeah, there we go. So it's the shrine. Just because here you can actually see the stucco on the outside of the shrine and how it's finished, right? And these big notches that you have here repeat on many of the shrines and would seem to be hinges, suggesting that these all had doorways closing them off. And so, anyways, get a little bit, you can tease a little bit out of these early photos. Here you get a nice sense of masonry. The imagery was set up against the back wall, and the stucco imagery was held with sockets. So, one assumes a wooden beam stuck out of this and supported the weight of the body of the figure. So that was in this shrine, this 37-foot tall. Now, in this court, they eventually add another court down here. They built a number of Buddhas up against this wall. So these 4 right here are these. And here you can see, so here's, I think this is Hargreaves. And here are the feet. You can see the feet of a couple of these Buddhas. But more importantly, I suppose for my initial talk, is here's a socket, here's a socket, there's another socket, another socket, and so on. So you can actually see how they were affixed to the wall. And actually, we can get a pretty good sense of how big the image was, right? When we zoom in, there's a yardstick. These are big images, and done in stucco. I think there's no question that these must be at the end of the site's, life. They are in a court that, you notice this court has been attached to the main sacred area. In other words, it's been leveraged out. And then these were added as a group. So much like this 15 courts. Someone came in here, they built a stupa, they built a court, and they built some monumental Buddhas, all as a group. Perfect. Right. Let me just show you. We also have these 2 stupas that survived in beautiful condition, not today, unfortunately, but in the early photos, you have this wonderful stupa. And I'm just having you know, so here's the stupa, the big stupa that was donated, and you get a very nice stucco image here in the background, giving you an idea of this late stucco production and an image in situ. And then surrounding this small stupa, well, look what you now have. You have rows of Buddhas. And in fact, these guys right here are holding their hand out in Virata mudra, and I believe are the only Gandharan examples of this mudra extant, period. There are no other, there's no schist examples, there are no other stucco examples. And I think this is just very compelling evidence to suggest it must have just been right at the end of the site's life when that small stupa was built. We're still getting very classical things happening in this very late horizon. Here's Jambala and Hariti. She holds a cornucopia. She's looking very classical. But we must now be almost at 450 AD. So when we think about classical contact, I mean, there's no Roman Empire at this point. It's long gone, right? The Romans kind of faded away at 200 AD, and here we are 250 years later. So I think that, the Gandharan classicism is a living, breathing, stylistic tradition that had nothing to do with influence exactly. I mean, there was a moment of contact where there was a taste for this kind of highly classical forms, but then it just, has a life of its own and goes on as a vital living force. I'll show you just a couple of other bits of stucco from the site. Although I would argue that most of the site was embellished in stucco decoration at the end of its life. That the schist imagery had been broken, had been used for hundreds of years, and that it was largely stucco towards the end. And these monumental images were the predominant. And we have lots of evidence for stucco. Oh, hold on. We have small shrines with niches. I throw this in. Now, hold on, let me just go back one. This court right here has a whole group of sculpture that are associated with it. And it's very interesting because if this court is a late addition, and then in that court we find all this nice stucco, but then we also find schist that presumably is associated with this latest period, I think it's very interesting we start to find very late iconography. For instance, here, this bodhisattva down at the bottom sits with his legs crossed. It's very much almost like a form that we find in Central Asia. That by the time we get to the 5th and 6th century, you could go to Khotan, you could go to Kizil, and you could find bodhisattvas that have this format. We get very complex stelae that have, dare I say, Shravasti miracle kind of iconography, this sort of, these epiphany, this sort of very complex imagery. And this is not alone. This little shrine down here, well, I just want to touch on a couple of these. We have these secondary shrines. There are 3 of them. They're hard to date because they're not part of the interlocking organization, but they typically contain reused imagery. And I just show you this L shrine here at the main stupa of Dhammarajaka, which had all of this narrative imagery. So there are some that are early, certainly. This is an early group, an association with one of these shrines. At TakhtiBahi, they have image niches in them. And here I would argue that they presumably contained stucco imagery, right? So late imagery. But fortunately, in the case of this small shrine, Stein excavated it, photographed it, and never published it. But the photographs survive. And it's full of late imagery, which is quite interesting. We get all sorts of Buddhas sitting on lotuses. We have figures, now he has his hand in the Dharmachakra mudra, which is certainly later than the narrative that we would see. Notice again the lotus base here. I love this small image with, Buddhas radiating out from him. Right? It's not an iconography that we find in the early horizon. It's a very kind of late, sophisticated one. A wonderful unfinished image is sitting in that same niche. So that's quite, I think, interesting. The one thing, and I imagine I'm really out of time now, that I would comment on is, okay, so the P1 stupa seems to be the initial genesis of the site. And they build shrines around it. And then someone adds an extra sacred area. Now, what's going on? In a sense, there's a multiplication of sacred areas. They've added a new stupa and shrines. And then again this happens with the addition of this stupa, and again shrines. But interestingly, this one and this one don't receive a lot of extra patronage. In other words, in the latest phase of the site, people are still building monumental shrines around this initial stupa. These are all bracketing the core stupa. Someone built this, but this is not the central stupa, nor is this one. As much as they might expand the site, they might add additional major stupas, this remains a devotional center. And then the very last thing I will say is it would seem that this was encouraged by the monastic community because you see the sacred area being extended. This set of chambers, these are underneath. This is a platform. And you just see a few late stupas being added to it. I would suggest they expanded the sacred area to encourage further donation. And that, in fact, that's what this is as well. This whole foundation, you can see it right here. Look at how high it is. It goes all the way down off the side of the mountain. And then this is the other edition. So they were adding in these sections so that they could, in a sense, create a place for donation. And I think this was very important, I would argue, for patronage. And across Gandharan sites, you find this addition, or this expansion of the sacred area, and especially at Jamagari and at TakhtiBahi, they're sitting empty. And it seems as though there's a moment where the patronage just dries up. And everything is going great guns, and well, who knows, is this the Huna's invasion of 450? Perhaps. Suddenly it ends, right? I strongly believe that a trickle of Buddhism continues in the Gandharan basin into the 5th and 6th century. Sorry, Bilal has some interesting late material. The Shajiki Deri Stupa has certainly things that must be 6th century. But the sort of collapse of patronage is readily apparent. And with that,
thank you very much. We got insight not just into our site, but into different ways of reading a site. And this is something that is really marvelous when you work with people who know the methods of archaeology to understand layering, to understand elements, which all of us would overlook and find significance in them. But I also felt so amazed by the role in your presentation again, like Professor Reed, the role of the photographs, which again themselves become objects to excavate. And it just seems so fascinating this morning to have seen so many of these old photographs which yield such incredibly rich and poignant and complicated amounts of information. It was absolutely great. We're not doing very well for time, so if there are questions from the house, I will keep my questions in abeyance. Are there things? Oh, there are a couple of people. Okay, Piche le jaye, please.
In a little book by Charles Allen, Buddha and the Sahibs, his premise is that Buddhism was rediscovered in India by officers and you know, people in the military service in the wonderful photographs that you have shown. Would you agree with that?
well, yes, I think this issue of the British coming in, you know, in as early as the 1830s and 40s into the region and discovering things that looked classical, and the fact that they were Buddhist, I mean, led to this fascination, not only with Gandhara and the sort of theoretical connection to the West, but also with Buddhism. And I think Buddhism caught the imagination of that community. And you know, there was this huge emphasis on studying the Buddhist remains. And in fact, if you really look at the history of the Archaeological Survey of India up until the 1930s, it's Buddhist sites that are privileged, one after the other.
My question relates to the birth children, and you have referenced about the mudras, and I don't understand the reference. When they obviously weren't there in the earlier period, when did they appear? Is it sort of post-Kushan? When did the mudras
Well, I mean,
appear?
when you take any individual piece, we're always very, I think, troubled by how to date an individual object. One can do style and group them. But the mudras do seem to be something that we have a little bit of control over because they, like for instance, the Virata mudra doesn't otherwise occur particularly, and then you find it once. Dharma Chakra, where he's you know, turning the wheel, he's holding his hands in the Dharma Chakra mudra. The simple fact that it is largely absent from the narrative, with the exception of perhaps some harmikas, which were on late you know, use of the mudra. You know, it's helpful. When does it happen? How do we know? I mean, I would think that we don't get, my opinion, we don't get the Dharma Chakra mudra even with the early icons of the Buddha. They tend to be in the later group. So if they start in the 3rd century, which is my feeling, then I would sort of, you know, give it another 100 years and sort of say it's the 4th century.
But why do the mudras suddenly?
You know, I think the mudras come in, oh, there you go. I think the mudras come in largely because as the narrative is stripped away, you need to be able to identify the figure. So it's fine to have the Buddha with monks and a wheel at the base, but it is so, in a sense, so much more elegant to just have it in the Dharmachakra mudra. And you rid yourself of all that narrative and you get this essentialized image of the Buddha. And I think that happens over and over again, this idea, the narrative disappears. And by the time we get just even into the probably mid-3rd century, you don't really have narrative anymore. When I was looking at the reuse, they will reuse images. Sari Bilal is a great example. They reuse images, they place all these icons around the bases of stupas. And I published on this. They have tons and tons of narrative at the site that they excavated. They don't use it in the late phase. They ignore it. They're not interested in the narrative in the late phase. They reuse the icons. So, I mean, I do think there's a moment when it just no longer is relevant.
But that's so interesting. That's why? Why the disinterest in the narrative?
Yes, right, isn't it? Well, and I think it must have something to do with the image of the Bodhisattva and of the Buddha.
Receiving veneration.
Receiving veneration. One needs to be very cautious. But I agree that the development of Buddhism is really at the key here, because we lack that same continuous production in India. You have this big burst of Kushan production in Mathura. Then you kind of have a gap. You don't know what's going on in the 3rd and 4th century. And then you kind of pick up with the Guptas again. Whereas in Gandhara, it seems like you have a nice continuous sort of